As I wrote in the abstract, the future of games is uncertain. Playing in this century will be contingent on many matters outside of our control, from outside temperatures to the supply chains for electronic devices and components. But conventional wisdom about games usually goes something like this. Games grant players limited agency over a bounded situation, play is consequence-free, and a way to experiment with identity and scenario without fear of repercussion. And I myself have made similar claims, at least in regard to environmental experimentation. But in preparing to talk to you today as part of this symposium around intergenerational equity, intersectionality, accessibility, and inclusion, I want to show that games are also bellwethers of our current and future precarity. In fact, thinking about things like climate disruption and climate change through games can usefully remind us of the vulnerability and risk that is at the heart of the play experience, and I think something that makes it very valuable. Okay. It also gives us a lens through which to view the surge of environmental movements led by very young people, which rhetorically often draw attention to the inertia of grown-ups and their governing bodies and point to the untimely end of their childhoods. So as I asked in my abstract, without really knowing what my answer was, how do we make the case that games are still a relevant medium and discourse for the Anthropocene and not just its impending relics? And, I've been wrestling with these problems for a while, but particularly since I published my first book, which Carl was really kind to show you, Playing Nature, Ecology, and Video Games. And this ultimately took a very hopeful attitude toward digital games and their ability to dramatize environmental consequence. In that project, I spoke generally about games that I've either played or was led to, sometimes analyzing the games closely for their content or mechanics, but also making a much broader case that gameplay and scientific work share a spirit of experimentation that I think is very important. And while most of the book dwells on games from the point of view of the player, at times it expands outward to the game industry and the environmental context of production and disposal of game hardware. And this kind of infrastructural consideration, as well as my work as the co-editor of a new open access journal, Media and Environment from UC Press, has increasingly led me to collaborate with more people from outside the academy, from game industry workers to curators and museum professionals and artists. And what I find is that outside of this small circle of specialists who study and make games or game adjacent art, games are, not the first thing that comes to mind when faced with solving the world's environmental problems. But for those who play, study, and design games, ludic solutions, or at least approaches to talking about solutions, don't seem far-fetched at all, and I'll circle back to that. So for me, the doubts started to creep in after I participated in this symposium on the cryosphere, or the frozen part of the Earth's crust, at the University of Alberta in 2018. And the symposium was really depressingly called After Ice. And there I toured an ice core repository and a melting glacier. This is my photo. And I listened to the other presenters, most of whom were from Canada, Australia, and the US, but others were from more impacted areas like Greenland. And I personally talked about games that are either about snow and ice or take place on snow and ice. So like Eline Media's Never Alone. And I also tried to make this argument that real world polar or cryospheric games are particularly effective reminders of these frequently overlooked environmental and social contexts of play. Given the disproportionate warming that occurs at the Earth's poles, those who inhabit the circumpolar north and conduct games upon it, like the indigenous Arctic Winter Games, will be among the first to recognize that the ecology of games is becoming increasingly untenable. And even the Olympic Winter Games are not immune. So, doing very broad reading, and I was stunned to find out that researchers had already estimated that 9 of the 21 or so traditional Winter Olympic host cities that are shown here in blue by country will not be reliably cold enough to stage the games within a few decades. And so I found this incredible irony in the century-old Olympic motto, which in Latin is Citius Altius Fortius, and stands for faster, higher, stronger, presumably celebrating the participants' athleticism, their elite athleticism. But it's so ironic in light of the planet's rapid temperature escalation and the increasing strength of weather events. So maybe it's fitting that on July 20th of this year, the International Olympic Committee approved a change to the motto, adding together after an en dash, or in Latin, communiter, to invoke, I guess, solidarity across difference. And, environmentally speaking, we are indeed all in this together. The wealthy or the temperately situated will be able to ignore or withstand climate disruption for longer than those without means or mobility, but eventually everyone will face a reckoning. And so looking at this stuff, like sports, I'm not really a sports scholar. What I care about is not so much that we're not going to be able to ski or snowboard with as much ease in 75 years, than that this fundamental assumption about games are about their prerequisite, which is that there is a level or fair playing field. And in this case, meaning that there's a climate stable enough that the course conditions are basically the same for every competitor. This assumption can no longer be taken for granted. And so when I've been talking about this work in other areas, I've experimentally tried to use Johan Huizinga's distinction between the cheat and the spoil sport from game studies to try to think about whether as a kind of spoil sport or something that renders play impossible or takes the quote unquote fun out of games. And I've looked at these conventional forms of athletic play as a way of demonstrating the inseparability of climate and games. And we could describe this as a thermodynamic approach to games or an atmospheric approach to games, doesn't really matter. I'll just point out that it's not just outdoor games and their macroclimates, but it's also those that we play on our devices indoors, subject to our attempts to establish and control domestic microclimates. And as an aside, I'll just say this kind of reminds me of work in media studies that's happening around air conditioning and climate control, and like Mal Ahern's work on early print and cinema production, or Yuri Furuhata's work on climate control and atmospheric art. So I would argue that the tendency to apply technological solutions to overheated, domestic, commercial, or in-case space, like you see here, with liquid cooling, fans, air conditioning, and so on, mimics in microcosm our society's growing interest in geoengineering fixes to climate change. So orbital mirrors, genetically amplified carbon capture, and so on. Or we could say the ways that the Olympic host cities have increasingly relied on technology to bypass climatic variation. So more and more of the events are happening in indoor climate controlled venues, artificial snow, and so on. And so for those of you who do know my work, this might seem like a really weird shift because it's less about the content of the games than the game industry and the role of game hardware and software in our kind of big Western carbon footprints. But I do think that environmental analysis of games has to include these questions of environmental justice or injustice, and to think through the intersection of games with these disproportionately distributed vulnerabilities to things like pollution, power outages, wildfires, heat waves, sea level rise, and so on. I did say this would be a little depressing. And we could add this to these pioneering studies in film and media production studies, like Bozak's The Cinematic Footprint, Hunter Vaughn's Hollywood's Dirtiest Secret, of course, Maxwell and Miller, Cubbett, I will come back to in a second. In game studies, I think for a long time, the go-to for kind of political economic study of games has been Games of Empire. But others that I've really relied on have been James Newman's Best Before and Ray Egan's Game After. And I'm really, really looking forward to Ben Abraham's forthcoming book, Digital Games After Climate Change, which I think will be a real, like a game changer for the field. So, in film and media studies, we have names for these kinds of analyses. When we are thinking about conditions of production and distribution, labor, structures of ownership, policy, regulation, and so on, we're doing media industries work. But when we radically expand what we say a medium is, to think not just about the content but about context, including geopolitics, energy use, infrastructure, waste, obsolescence, and so on, were in this realm of environmental media studies. So I mentioned before that I was a co-founder of this journal, which really tries to take this intersection seriously. And it's open access, so I encourage you to just go look around and see what's there. And when I teach my students about the ecology of games, I just want them to know that the materials that go into their hardware, the game hardware that we're using, has been implicated in years of armed conflict, like the PlayStation War. I think you all are kind of familiar with this. I won't go on about it, but that was really about coltan, but there's also talk about cobalt and particularly today lithium because of electric batteries. Thinking about contexts like the Democratic Republic of Congo, mining operations, a lot has been written about e-waste. This famous Vertinsky photo of a woman in China that's processing motherboards. Others like Jen Holt and Patrick Vonderau, Alison Carruth, Mel Hogan, lots of people have written about data centers now. And these are those anonymous looking buildings that are often built near rivers or in colder climates that house thousands upon thousands of servers for internet and cloud service companies like Facebook or Amazon Web Services. This happens to be a Google data center in Finland. And it just so happens that I recently finished a chapter on cloud gaming with the late Jeff Watson, who taught at USC. And we were looking at the marketing rhetoric of services like Google Stadia, probably the most famous, but there's also Sony's PlayStation Now, NVIDIA's GeForce Now, Project xCloud by Microsoft, Electronic Arts Project Atlas, Amazon's Project Tempo, Valve's Steam Cloud Gaming. There are a lot of nows and projects. And if you follow cloud gaming at all, you would know that services like Stadia, they generally argue that by moving processing power away from the devices of players and into remote data centers, they can eliminate the hassle of game downloads, enable players to synchronize their progress across screens, and obviate, eliminate the need for consumers to purchase these expensive consoles and PCs to play the latest games. And this is what they say is the future of games. So it sounds pretty nice, but in practice, when you sort of drill down and look at what happens, it requires this huge bandwidth hose. I think there was one study that showed that the streaming service consumes something like a terabyte of data in about 65 hours of gameplay. And so in our chapter, Jeff and I tried to challenge this industrial narrative from both a historical perspective and an environmental perspective. So historically, games streaming is so late to the game following film, television, and radio distribution. And environmentally speaking, we were questioning the sustainability of services that really depend on high-powered servers and huge increases in data transmission. So against the industrial narrative of liberation and immateriality, we argue in the chapter that cloud gaming, in fact, constitutes an intensification of resource use and a doubling down of the concealment of the physical and material realities on which our media use depends. And we use the phrase infrastructure as a play, it's really Jeff's phrase, to label these issues, where infrastructure is anything from a data center or a power plant to the changing climate of the earth itself. And I think many of us have been lulled into thinking that the cloud or Wi-Fi or mobile devices must be better for the planet than buying and shipping hard copies or using a big desktop PC or a wired network. But it always turns out that the calculations aren't that simple. And some film and media scholars, I think, are leading the way. They're actually starting to work with engineers to do things like determine the carbon footprint of streaming video on demand services. I love to share this comparison. Laura Marks, the film scholar, wrote in our Media and Environment journal, asking people to think twice about streaming a clip at the highest resolution possible, or at the very least to do so like we would order and consume a steak at a restaurant. So recognizing it as the resource intensive culmination of unsustainable land and energy practices. And if you're going to do it, at least really enjoy it, savor it, right? And of course, we could talk about all these other things that are happening where people are trying to develop more energy efficient coding or development practices. I have to insert that warning that efficiency isn't always the best bar because there's Jevons paradox, which was named after the English economist who said, who noticed that the English actually consumed more coal after the invention of the more efficient steam engine than before. So this idea that efficiencies only breed greater consumption. So this is all of this first half of this talk is just to say that this approach to media from cradle to grave isn't just a sort of optional way to do it, but I think it's essential to any approach to media, and especially games. So it matters, just like it matters that lots of TV shows that are supposedly happening in Los Angeles are actually filmed in Canada or New Zealand, or that Benjamin Bratton has said that we carry, all of us, bits of Africa around in our pocket if you own a smart device. It also matters that Nintendo, which really capitalizes on these associations with nature and with wholesome environments with games like Animal Crossing, initially came in dead last on Greenpeace's Guide to Greener Electronics. This is quite a while ago, but Nintendo's down at the very bottom at 0. And so, my career so far has been trying to express these hopes that games are growing more environmentally intelligent, even as the sort of defining pleasurable uncertainty of games and play is being undermined by extreme environmental uncertainty. And so I said I would come back to Covet, but this kind of quote from his intro just like stopped me in my tracks. So in Finite Media, he says, even communicating one's love of nature implies damaging it. And so presumably if you make a nature documentary or serious game, eco game, you're still contributing to this problem. And so I think in a way, my talk title, The Relics of Play, was my kind of invitation for an imaginative project or a kind of future media archaeology or counterfactual history, I guess. And I think there's the scene in Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl. If you haven't read it, it's okay, but it takes place in the future where the sea level has risen and energy is no longer as abundant and everybody counts energy in terms of joules. And there's a scene where this old gas-powered car drives by and all the people in the scene just look at it like it's this obscene relic of a past age. And so thinking about that scene, kind of thinking about like, what are future gamers going to think of us when they look back at our present? And I would like to imagine that they'll look at the late 20th and early 21st centuries as a time of like glorious, but also foolish overabundance of hardware, energy consumption, and very individualistic electronics use. And I'd like to think they're going to be looking at that from the vantage point of a future with repairable, low energy consuming and long lasting devices, which may even be shared in a return to the early time sharing days of mainframe computers. I'm hoping their energy grids will be fully renewable, and that maybe after a period, the great abstinence, that they'll even be able to hold LAN parties again. And then maybe they'll look back at the titles and obsessions of today's games and laugh a little about all the games with really patent environmental insensitivity, like all the games with infinite resources and interest in destructibility and all about polygon counts, that sort of stuff. And to me, that actually seems like a more likely and hopeful future than something like Richard Powers's The Overstory. Oh my gosh, I can't count the number of people that read this book and then came to me and said, oh my gosh, there's a character in here who makes a game. You have to look at this book. And I've read it. It's just okay. I mean, I like other Powers's novels better. But so in this book, there's a character, Nilay Mehta, who grows up in Silicon Valley with his Gujarati computing enthusiast dad. And as a kid, he has this freak fall from a tree that leaves him largely paralyzed. And then he just it kind of forces him to dwell more in a virtual world. And he becomes an amazing computer programmer and designs a hugely popular series of games that are very reminiscent of Civilization. And they're called, I kid you not, Mastery 2, 3, 4, and then eventually Mastery Online. And toward the end of his life, Nilay grows tired of the game and his employees and just the sort of constant grind of creating more content for to keep the subscribers happy. And he sets out to create something that he can be really proud of. And he goes back to his roots in open source. And so he makes this huge sprawling game. And Richard Powers, he writes, quote, "He will not live to see it completed, this game played by countless people worldwide, a game that puts the players smack in the middle of a living, breathing planet filled with potential they can only dimly begin to imagine, but he has nudged it along," end quote. And, so everybody raced to me to say, you've got to read this. But because on face, it sounds a lot like the games that I've been agitating for, where the game environment isn't just a backdrop, but it has its own agency and the social and environmental actors mix. But there's just something about the sort of patness of the game and the sort of sanctimoniousness of Meta's vision of the game that turns me off. And maybe it's it's kind of petty, but it might be because the character in the book initially has his inspiration from kind of wandering around Stanford's main quad and looking up at the trees, and then this spark of inspiration strikes him and he makes the game. But it's just so much like this genius designer story. And I think the language of nudges is also probably not accidental on Powers's part. And it kind of reminds me of this recent interest in green nudges rather than shoves that are less upsetting to people in the status quo. And so, maybe the game in this book is just not that appealing because I can't imagine the ultimate game without also thinking about how the game is distributed and powered and consumed and eventually abandoned, and how such a big simulation could actually operate sustainably. But if you go back to that quote, it actually describes the situation that we're in on this planet, right? We won't live to see it completed. This is being played by countless people worldwide. We're in the middle of a living, breathing planet filled with potential that we can only dimly begin to imagine. So maybe there's that to redeem it. So I promised I would pivot to some more optimistic stuff. So at this point, we feel a little discouraged. For me, I'm at that point where it's like, oh my gosh, should I throw my PlayStation in the river? Of course, you wouldn't do that. You would find a responsible way to recycle it, but don't do that. I still think there are ample reasons to play, and that games are vital to our cultural response to environmental crisis. And at risk of stating the obvious, I just want to acknowledge some of the reasons why play and advocacy don't seem like a good pair. So for many, play still is to participate in a foolish and charming world of childhood. And as adults, it's the Protestant work ethic or whatever, we're trained to see play as a failing or a regression, right, to immature pastimes. And as I talked about in Playing Nature, a lot of the environmentally oriented criticism of electronics and games is framed in terms of the question, why would you play video games when you could just go play outside? And behind this really paternalistic question is this foundational one of why would you even play at all when the world is on fire? And the cynical answer, I guess, actually was given to me by Kim Stanley Robinson when I read Ministry for the Future. And the answer is, one answer at least, is that we might as well play because we're doomed anyway, and we should enjoy ourselves while we can. And Robinson in this book, he describes all these kinds of pathological responses to news of environmental collapse. And one of them is avoidance, right? And in some quarters, he says, this has been given the name, the Mask of the Red Death syndrome, named for the Edgar Allan Poe story, where nobles throw this lavish masquerade in a castle despite an encroaching plague in the countryside. And, I guess, playing in light of all these environmental and social costs of electronics supply chains and energy consumption can feel like this kind of reckless indulgence. And of course, we could definitely talk about the way that play, many forms of it are forms of privilege, right? The ability to own and upgrade devices, access to robust internet connections, even electricity, the leisure time to be able to invest hours into game experiences. But in the rest of my time, I want to emphasize three aspects of play that I think make it this important and still neglected aspect of our, grappling with environmental crisis. So play is actually hard work. I actually hate the stock photo. I know there's all these like silly gendered sort of thing, but I put it in here because I love her side eye, the little girl side eye. So in one of my favorite lines from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she writes that play is the way we, quote, limber up for the work of the world, end quote. And she was writing about playing in the mud and finding inspiration in nature and its rhythms. But I find it significant that Kimmerer is able to hold up our capacity for joy, gratitude, and silliness against the crushing effects of settler colonialism and capitalism. And as both a botanist and a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, Kimmerer sees scientific knowing and indigenous ways of knowing as differently potent and recognizes that experiencing wonder and pleasure in the world beyond us is powerful. And I would say that, social play especially demands a lot of us. It might seem counterintuitive, but crafting and sustaining play takes effort. And we could name here like Espen Arthseth's work on non-trivial labor required to, traverse a ludic text. But I just would say, I have an 8-year-old, and all of these countless imaginary scenarios that he comes up with when we have downtime, which he calls talking games, are exhausting, right? So they're usually based on whatever he's reading or playing at the time. So I've played all these talking games based on Zelda or Magic the Gathering or D&D or Harry Potter, the Stardew Valley. And so when I'm playing with him, it's really easy to remember that play is exertion. And when I'm playing only half-heartedly, looking at my phone or trying to fold laundry or cook dinner, he knows, right? Kids have this laser-like sense of wavering commitment, and they know when you're not fully invested. So it takes, so thinking about play in relation to this like investment of work, right, or effort, we could relate this maybe in the Q&A to all the conversations around difficulty, and not the skill-based difficulty that we typically celebrate in game studies, but more like the kind of subtle negotiations that have been talked about in queer game studies, where things like boredom, discomfort, embarrassment, awkwardness, no fun, and so on can actually be by design. And so like a way of upending the conventions of games. And I just want to suggest that, finding ways to reach consensus on things like climate change, or mitigating future damage or taking environmental responsibility, it kind of operates by the same mechanisms as agreeing to play with others, right? It requires commitment, curiosity, communication, and the ability to kind of show emotion so that others know where you are. The next thing is just play does make us vulnerable. This is from the Mo Willems Elephant and Piggy books. Can I Play Too, where the snake really wants to play with Elephant and Piggy. He wants to play catch, but they're sort of stumped because he doesn't have arms, but they figure out a way to do it. This is sort of my way of saying that choosing to play is a kind of volunteerism, which entails risk of some kind. So playing always exposes you to judgment, whether it's internalized or extrinsic. And it takes a lot to let go of our inner critics, right? This is stupid, I'm going to look silly. And give enough of ourselves to make the fiction or forward momentum of a game work. And I see this all the time when I run workshops. I sometimes run play workshops and design workshops, either for students or for public audiences. And there are always those that have to be coaxed to participate, and a few who just haunt the edges as spectators or disengage from the activity. And I think one of the reasons that the imaginative play of young children never fails to astonish is because they aren't at all concerned with what makes sense or what they'll look like in front of others. And vulnerability is important because given the precarity of warming climates, vulnerability is a condition that we all share. And it's one that spans national boundaries, species, and generations. And so lately, I find myself gravitating toward games that can offer me this experience of both shared exposure and also a kind of small comfort. So this is Cozy Grove by Spry Fox. It was released in spring of this year. And to me, it was like what Animal Crossing New Horizons was to a lot of people in the first year of the pandemic. It's a way to escape into this charming landscape populated by interesting animal friends. But where Animal Crossing has this undeniably childlike quality, Cozy Grove It seems built for the sarcasm-prone adult with lots of offhand quips about capitalism, sorry, this is the right one, dash dreams, and even alcoholism presented in these weird, slyly innocuous ways. So the basic premise of the game is that you play as a young spirit scout, kind of like American Girl Boy Scouts, but with a paranormal edge. And you're accidentally stranded on this haunted island for your first fieldwork adventure. And at first, the island is mostly colorless and hidden from view, but as you set up your campsite and begin to talk to these long dead bears that used to live in Cozy Grove, you start to illuminate both literally and figuratively your surroundings. And it turns out every bear has some kind of, almost every bear, has some unresolved business that seems to be keeping them from passing into the afterlife peacefully. Unfulfilled ambitions, they need to atone for some, terrible behavior, or there was some kind of family strife. And as a spirit scout, you kind of work to gain their trust and help them to achieve this passing. So you're kind of like a therapist more than an exorcist. And I think Cozy Grove does embed a lot of useful environmental lessons, has this really interesting world of lots of non-human and undead inhabitants, flowers, trees, bushes, bugs, shells, fish, bears, and imps. But it's also interesting how the island's residents talk about the natural world. Even there are some characters that are just really outwardly terrible, like a capitalist, a hoarder, a megalomaniacal mayor, a doomsday prepper, and a conspiracy theorist. But there are others who are like almost absurdly in tune with nature, like Francesca Duclaw, who is a she-bear specializing in wood carving that regularly confuses trees with books and claims to be close friends with trees named Thoreau, Kafka, and Proust. So it's just like a really rich and interesting game. And I love that it collides these realms that are often seen as separate, like nature and coziness, or ghosts and landscapes. Because we as humans typically think of coziness and haunting as things that take place in our habitations. So it's interesting because it stretches your brain to think about coziness in the outdoors, and to also think of animal spirits lingering in the landscapes where they used to live. And I should say, this is not a stretch for indigenous cultures, where landforms are often seen as traces of ancestors or of past events, right? And in this era of climate change, our landscapes, it's just interesting to think about how they're anything but cozy, right? They're dangerously unpredictable. And they are also increasingly haunted by species extinctions and the remnants of burned, flooded, and buried communities, or even, barely remembered snowfall or rain. And so to me, this game just sort of, it sidesteps that uncomfortable reality, but also makes me feel connected to it. And then the last point is just that, playing is one of the few domains where young people already lead the way. So, these images of Greta Thunberg when she was 15, I think, protesting alone in front of the Swedish parliament for her school strike for climate, really stuck with me. And I thought about it for many years. And there's no doubt that not just Thunberg, but these millions of young climate activists have helped to transform the nature of climate discourse. Sunrise Movement, Fridays for Future, you can name quite a few. But what fascinated me is that part of what makes them so arresting is that is their refusal in some ways to play, right? So they regularly tell us that they can't be normal kids, while adults who should know better are ignoring the realities of climate change. And this has a really forceful impact, but it also leaves me like, it's not satisfying. Like for me, surely there has to be also room for play in activism and outside of that. And to me, it's playful to choose to sail across the Atlantic rather than fly, even if it's in the name of carbon savings. It's playful to skip school. Or to thumb your nose at grownups. And so I just think maybe that discourse is not the most useful ultimately. We could talk about reproductive futurism and the critiques of that kind of logic. And I would just mention briefly this game, Alba, A Wildlife Adventure by Us Two, which I think kind of captures a little bit of the spirit of childhood defiance, enlightened defiance. And the characters, the main one is Alba, meaning dawn in Spanish. It takes place on this Mediterranean island, and where she's visiting her grandparents for the summer, and she discovers that the mayor is plotting to destroy the local wetlands, to set up a hotel with a developer. And so her best friend Inez helps her to try to like document the local wildlife and get signatures on petitions, and turn the wetlands into a nature sanctuary. And there's this one moment in the game that really also kind of made me think, where you have like I think it's the mayor who's like really angry at her. It says, do you seriously think someone like you can make a difference? And you have to either, like if you're using your PC, you move your mouse up and down or left and right to either nod or shake your head. And it's like a very simple moment, but it's really interesting and kind of sobering. And the way that the game is structured, it's almost impossible to shake your head. Like, yeah, I do think I can make a difference. And I would say that both Alba and Cozy Grove are kind of concerned with these intergenerational debts. I think the difficulty of climate change is that many people realize that the steps that we take now to mitigate temperature rise will not be appreciable in our lifetimes, let alone our children's or our children's lifetimes. And this is really apparent in games like Alba, where she's so mad at the mayor and the hotel developer who play short-term gain before long-term legacies. But there are other adults in the town who are, eager to help out, and do things to, save animals and treat sick animals. And there are also good adults in Cozy Grove that we could talk about. And there's this sort of sense of needing to let go and let a new generation finish the work. And I just wanted to end, I've been reading all this kind of stuff for fun. And it's a different future is imagined in this science fiction novel by the Chinese author Cixin Liu, who's better known for the three-body problem. But supernova era is this crazy story of a supernova that happens in Earth's neighboring space, and the radiation from it basically means that everybody over the age of 13 dies within a year. And so all the adults on the world have this really short period of time to try to train their children to take over in their absence. And Liu really imagines this, imagines games and children's tendency to play in a very dark way. So the children of the supernova era, they willingly engage in these world games that result in thousands and thousands of deaths because of their inclination toward play. And they use very simple techniques like tanks, bayonets, missiles, and so on. But, at the same time, play is also what allows the novel to end on an optimistic note. I will kind of not give you the spoilers, but the play is also what kind of unites all of the world's children in the equivalent of a massively multiplayer online game that's run by a powerful AI, and through which they can kind of speak of their discontent and their needs to the world's children leaders, right? So I'm just offering you all these examples as a provocative mix to try to end the symposium around these terms like youth and vulnerability and work. And I know that play alone is not going to fix things, but it may restore us and it may guide us as we choose our next steps. I was also reading this book, you probably can't see it, the slides, but Sarah Ray's A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, which is really written for Gen Z. And this is my reproduction of her figure for the arc of environmental studies curricula when she's teaching students in environmental studies. This is kind of where there's the fall from idealism into this nihilistic period of like self-hate, which turns around in that middle part, the self-care, rediscover pleasure, bake cookies phase. And I think games are sort of maybe part of that pivot, right? To kind of to make the pivot to hope, efficacy, and ultimately resilience. So I think I'll just stop there.